Well, today we're going to talk about leftovers and a story of just enough and not an abundance comes from this week, where my children and all of my nieces and nephews are at my parents' place, and I think have been eating my mom and dad out of house and home. And I heard of at least one story where my mom bought like a big Costco box of ice cream sandwiches, probably thinking that those were going to last the whole week. I think that was one meal. So sometimes in life, we have just enough. But today we want to talk a little bit about what it means to have more than enough, what it means to have an abundance, what it means for there to be leftovers. Well, I know that as my family has grown and changed over the years, my relationship, our experience of leftovers has changed. There are certain meals where it used to be a time when Kevin and I were the only ones eating it, that was definitely 2 full meals and maybe like a couple of lunches. And then we moved into, it's 1 meal and a couple of lunches for somebody if the kids grow. Sometimes now it's only 1 meal. That's it. There's nothing left over. And I remember one time in the past year, it was Arthur's turn to clean up after supper, and the rest of us had places to go and things to do. So he was doing his work. And then the next day, and there was a little bit of food left on the table, so I was anticipating leftovers. And then when I went to look for them in the fridge the next day, I said to Arthur, "Hey, what happened to those leftovers?" He's like, "Oh, I just ate them." So, we're kind of like having this changing experience of what it means to have more than enough in our house. When I plan a party, I'm sure this is true for many of you, we want to move it from being just fuel to being a feast. It helps us feel celebratory. It helps us feel cared for. We feel excited. We feel blessed. And leftovers in these kinds of contexts, they signal that feeling of fullness, of being satisfied and content, and more than that it's overflowing. It's a blessing. Well, as we've moved to the summer, I know I haven't been with you all this many weeks of summer, but as we've been moving through various stories in Matthew's gospel this summer, we've been talking a little bit about being in the middle with Matthew. These are the stories that are in between the Christmas story of Jesus' birth and the things that happen before Jesus is arrested and put on trial, crucified, and raised. These are the moments where Jesus is interacting with his disciples. He's teaching, and he's helping them, and he's calling them, and he's healing people, and occasionally miracles come to pass. But part of why I think it's helpful for us to think about life in the middle with Matthew is because this is where we also live our lives, in the middle. We're in between our own births and deaths. We're in between big moments all the time. Life is ordinary. Life is regular. Sometimes life gets boring or stressful. All of these are what it means to live in the middle. And so as we're in the middle with Jesus, we're trying to catch a glimpse of what does it mean to follow Jesus in these daily experiences and challenges of what it means to be human and what it means to seek faith. Well, today's story that Anne read for us, this is a miracle, and it's about leftovers. It's one of Jesus' well-known miracles that he feeds all of these people, and there's so many parts of this story that we could focus on. We could spend a whole sermon talking about the crowd's need. We could spend a whole sermon talking about Jesus' compassion. I actually think I've preached that sermon before, so I'm not focusing on that one as much today. We could focus on how the disciples see things and how we might sometimes feel like we've got the view of the disciples. We could talk about the surprise supper itself. We'll touch on all of these things. But today I really want us to keep in mind how this story ends, where it lands, with the baskets full of leftovers. That there's an exclamation point on this story. That while Jesus is doing this wonderful thing, this is how it turns up. And so to help us, I have a couple of visual cues for us to help us keep the abundance metaphor in our minds. So the first is 12 baskets at the front. Now they're not full, but you can imagine they're full. 12 baskets. I have no idea how big the disciples' baskets were. Maybe they were much larger than this, and it would have been a much more overwhelming kind of a prospect. But here are 12 baskets. And just to help us sort of get a sense of, I think, the magnitude of this, I have another prop that will help us sort of think about these baskets and ourselves. So, not enough. In fact, I'm only going to take one out of here, one Timbit. So the way this story goes, it's as if one person has one Timbit. And then we all proceed to eat as many Timbits as we can possibly stuff our faces with, till we are full and satisfied and couldn't even imagine having another Timbit. And then after we've done this, we pass around these 12 baskets, and they come back full of Timbits. This is the story we're reading this morning. One Timbit, a bunch of people, empty baskets that come back full to overflowing. So I want you to have that image in your mind. All right. I'll tell you right now, I don't have enough Timbits for everybody. So if you want a Timbit after the service, it's going to be a first come, first serve. I'm not Jesus. All right, so this is kind of where we're at. This is what we've got in mind. I don't know where to set the Timbit now. Okay. I could eat it, but then, that's right. It'll be like Communion Sunday where I have to quickly eat it so that I'm able to speak again quickly. All right, this is where we are. So part of what I want us to think about today, how do we think about abundance when it comes to our faith? I actually don't think this is a comfortable idea for us all the time. We think in terms of scarcity. We think in terms of simplicity. I think we're all very aware of the excesses and the greed of the world. And so whenever we think of there being too much of something, our minds immediately go there. And we should be thoughtful about that. We should be discerning about that. But God's abundance does not equal our greed. So we have to try to separate those two ideas. So what does it mean for us to think about the fact that we are people of faith, people who have a leftover kind of faith, not a secondhand faith, but an abundant faith? There's more than enough, that God is a God who gives. How do we think about that? And what does that call us to as we seek to live out the lives of faith we have here in the middle? Well, we've got our 12 baskets. We've got our one Timbit. How are we going to get from here to there? I think the first thing we need to think a little bit about is the context of this story. When this story started, there was a very simple line that you may have even missed as Anne was reading. The first little phrase. Now, when Jesus heard this. What's the this? What did Jesus hear? Well, if we were to have started at the beginning of chapter 14 instead of picking up in this moment, what Jesus just heard is that his friend, John the Baptist, has been killed. Herod has beheaded him. It's a gruesome death. It's a terrible situation. John spoke truth to power. He said to Herod, "You are doing things that are not right." And Herod didn't like that. This is also not the bad Herod from the beginning of Matthew. We've already been through one difficult Herod in Matthew who kills all the babies in search of Jesus or hoping to also wipe Jesus out. This is his son, who also seems to be kind of a bad guy, or at least a guy who does bad things. So this Herod doesn't like what John says and gets caught up in one of those corruptible, kind of ridiculous moments that rulers seem to get caught up in. And it ends up, after some weakness and some indulgence, in violent murder. John is dead at the hands of the empire. And this is what Jesus heard at the very beginning of this story. So, Jesus decides he would like to be alone. Wouldn't we all? Wouldn't we all? Jesus says, we see Jesus in this, the text tells us he withdraws. He gets on a boat. He goes to a lonely place. He retreats. I think this is one of those moments where we see Jesus' humanity, the human part of Jesus, on full view. Because I'm sure he's grieving. And he might also be concerned for his own safety. John just got killed by the Herod, by the ruler, for saying things that he didn't like to hear. And we know that Jesus' own experience of this is coming only a few chapters later. So Jesus is sad, and Jesus is perhaps scared, and Jesus retreats. He wants to be alone. I think if we're thinking about Jesus in this moment, this isn't a basket filled to overflowing moment. This is a basket empty moment. This is not having enough, not having the things that are comforting and, embracing and soft and warm. This is one of those moments, and we know it too. When we experience death and loss, it hollows us out a bit. When we feel scared and insecure, it chips away at our strength and our stability. This is a low moment for Jesus, a not enough moment, a vulnerable moment. And I don't think we should rush past that, because this is the moment that sets the scene for everything that follows. So what happens next? Well, Jesus is trying to be alone, and it says the crowds seek him and find him. They're looking for him, and they're very good at this. They keep finding him even when he wants to be on his own. And they need his help. They aren't just seeking him out for a visit or to give him a hug. They want him to do something for them. They're sick, and they're likely at their wits' end. It's difficult being sick in any time. I imagine it was very difficult being sick in this part of the world at this time in history. There probably weren't very many resources or caregivers or providers. So all of these people probably felt like Jesus was their last hope. Their baskets were also empty. And so we have Jesus having an empty basket moment. We have this crowd of people seeking him out, longing to be filled, longing to receive something they need. And this is what sets the scene. These are the planks for our story. Jesus sees the people, and it says he has compassion. He brings his boat to the shore. He begins healing those who are sick. And from the sounds of it, this goes on all day. We don't get a lot of details, but the next phrase is going to tell us, as evening was approaching. So it sounds like Jesus didn't just do this once or twice. Jesus extended himself to help fill the baskets, metaphorically, of these empty people. So we've got Jesus wanting to be alone. We've got the people seeking him out, needing a touch from him. And then the disciples enter the scene, who, in my view, are just being human and practical. They have got a huge group of people who are getting hungry. They're out in a lonely place. It's sort of meant to evoke the idea of the wilderness, the desert from the Exodus, right? They're in a place where there's not enough food. They've got all of these people. It's complicated trying to get them fed. So they said, this is the time for sending them home. We've also all been there too, right? Where we're like, okay, guess this is the time to go home. I don't have anything more for you. The disciples themselves were likely tired and hungry. They've also been at it all day with Jesus. They were probably also weighed down with this news about John. That's not easy to hear or to deal with. And so they look around and they say, okay, Jesus, time to wrap it up. But Jesus, who's been healing people all day, Jesus, who now hears the disciples' idea that we should send them away, looks at the disciples and said, well, you feed them, as if something can come out of nothing. And the disciples reply, we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. We have 1 timbit for this whole congregation. We don't have enough. And I think it's important to pause here too. The we don't have enough experience. I feel like when I read this, the disciples talking to Jesus, I can almost hear their voices cracking with stress as they're like, we can't do this. You are asking too much. We have no idea how this would work. But somehow Jesus is seeing enough where they can't see it. I think we've all had moments like this, right? Where we feel like we're up to here, we don't have anything more, we don't have enough. Not enough time, not enough resources, not enough companionship. We get frustrated, we get desperate. It starts to stir up all these difficult feelings in us. Sometimes we feel that empty, hollowed out feeling. We feel despair rising up in us. And when we're living through these kinds of low moments, the idea that baskets like the ones up here could be filled to overflowing, the distance between where we are and those baskets being what they're going to become doesn't just seem improbable, it seems impossible that there's a way to get from here to there. So the disciples are feeling this, and we feel it too as we read the story. So much of our lives are touched by these empty basket moments, aren't they? We live through political corruption, things we see in the news that make us sigh and despair. We're living through sicknesses, we're living through losses, we're living through lack of resources. Everywhere we look, we can see the ways there's just not enough. So this story isn't maybe quite as far away from us as we at first think. Sometimes I think when we hear and read the miracle stories, we think, well, I have not had any miracles in my life. I don't think this means anything to me. But these people are experiencing a lot of the same things that we do. And somehow Jesus at the center of this story can see something that they can't see. So, in verse 18, Jesus takes the wheel. Jesus decides, okay, give me what you've got. And so Jesus takes the loaves and the fishes. He has all the people sit down. And then it says he takes it, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it. What does that sound like? We take, we bless, we break, and we share. This is the same pattern we use every time we celebrate communion together, every time we come to the Lord's table. And so this moment on the hillside with all these random people gives us a glimpse of where Jesus is going with his disciples and where we're heading as the people of God. And in this miraculous moment, all of a sudden, there's not just enough, there's more than enough. The people start eating, and they eat, and after they've eaten their fill, they collect up the baskets of leftovers. I think it's also kind of interesting, important for us to remember that this is a group of people that probably never got to eat their fill, ever. Food scarcity in the Roman Empire was real. And these were poor people. These are not the rich people who were living in palaces and feasting on, big tables of food. These are the people who never had enough. And somehow, out in this lonely place, with this compassionate Jesus, they eat until they're full. And there is a bunch left over. This is not just a meal for fuel. This is a feast. In the space of this day, the disciples and the crowds have seen what was empty and verging on despair and desperation in every sense get full to overflowing. They've witnessed a tiny little meal of fish and bread become more than enough. We've also, as we move through this, paid attention to this, and then we wonder, well, what about when my basket feels that empty? Can I expect the kind of abundance that the crowd experienced on that day? What does it look like to live a life of faith that's touched by these kinds of leftovers? Well, I want us to think about 3 different ways that we're shown in Scripture what God's abundance means for the life of faith. The first has to do with this particular story. We're just looking at the feeding of the 5,000 this morning. Feeding 5,000 people, this is a story happening in Jewish territory, so this is probably a Jewish crowd. And as Jesus feeds them, they get 12 baskets left over. 12. We've heard that number before in Scripture. 12 often is the sign of the completeness of the 12 tribes of Israel. So there's something about this story that's communicating to Jesus' disciples and to those who read and tell it down through the generations. There is enough for all of the people who are part of our Jewish family. There is enough for us, more than enough. Don't get stressed out. Don't get uptight. There is enough for all of us. But this is not the only story, because if we turn the page in the Gospel of Matthew and move over to Matthew 15, we get the feeding of the 4,000. You'll remember there's a second story. But that story doesn't happen in Jewish territory. That story happens among the Gentiles. Jesus feeds a group that's actually not considered to be inside the embrace of God's grasp by everyone who might be there to receive. And they get 7 baskets left over, 7 often symbolizing the completeness of God, the 7 days of creation. So between these two stories, we're getting the message. There is enough. There is more than enough space in God's house and in God's family for everyone. This is the motivator. This is the driver of the entirety of Matthew's gospel. You'll remember right at the beginning, Jesus is born and the Magi show up. These are not the people that the Messiah was supposed to come to save. And yet, there they are, and there Jesus is, and boom, the circle gets bigger. And so here, as we think about the abundance of God, what does that mean? It means there is space enough for everyone to be a part of God's family. That's not always easy for us to think about. That's not always easy for us to accept. But right here, Jesus shows us, Matthew tells us, this is what the abundance of God looks like. Or what about the kingdom parables? We've read and heard several of those in recent weeks. Last week we talked about the little tiny seeds and the little bit of yeast. They're so teeny tiny, could they possibly make a difference? But they burst into a big plant. They raise up loaves of bread. There's shelter, there's food, there is enough for what people need. There's provision. And we talked about how Jesus charges the disciples. You need to learn how to tell the good news of the kingdom. You need to learn how to get out there and say, the kingdom of heaven is like a seed, some yeast, a timbit, some baskets, whatever it is in regular life that proclaims the good news that God is present, that God is active, that there is space, that you are included, that you are loved. This is what God's abundance looks like. Or what about prophetic imagination? Because this miraculous feast also reminds us of all of the visions that we encounter when we're reading the prophets. And those visions come up when the people are in a bad place. They're not at home. They don't have a place to live. They don't have food. They're under threat from enemy armies. All sorts of bad things are happening. And yet in the midst of that, the prophets are constantly calling the people, activate your imagination. Remember what God has done for us. Imagine what God can do for us. Another text we could have spent time in this week comes from Isaiah 55. Hear, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. And you who have no money, come, buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without price. An image of enough, more than enough, for everyone in need. A vision of a time when God provides, a time of deep and abiding hope. So we see, as we brush up against this story of leftovers, of more than enough, we also see that woven throughout the story of Matthew's gospel and the story of God's people through history, even and especially in times of profound emptiness. Times when we are certain that the only thing we know is that we do not have enough. We are reminded that the God we love and we worship is a God of abundant life, a God who loves leftovers, a God whose mercy and compassion run deeper and wider and never fail. We see that what is empty can be filled, that what is broken can be shared in ways beyond our expectations. We see in all of these and in this story in Matthew's gospel, on that shoreline, we see Jesus at the center, compassionate Jesus, loving Jesus, self-giving Jesus, offering life and restoration to those who seek him and those who find him. And when we find Jesus, we find what we are looking for. So one of the questions a story like this, a story of 12 basketfuls full of leftovers, leaves us with is, do we believe that God is enough, more than enough, for what we face in this life? Because our God is not just enough. Our God is not a box of Costco ice cream bars that get eaten up way before you expect them to. Our God is a God of abundance, a God of leftovers, a God of more than we can ask or imagine. Thanks be to God.